Not quite game to start in case there's more. That was something else. Good job, team. Wow, hard act to follow, that one. Well, morning, everyone. My name's DJ, if we've not met. I'm the lead pastor here. If you're visiting with us, we're so glad you're here. Let me just add my personal welcome to that of Matt earlier and the team. Glad you made time and found the courage to come amongst us this morning, and we would like to get to know you and welcome you in. And please do help yourself, as Matt said, to a coffee on the house afterwards. Free coffees for visitors and volunteers here at New Vine. So if you're one of those, then that's on us. Well, for our regular New Viners, this might be one of those ones this morning. Those ones where you leave at the end thinking, I don't know what DJ was on about this morning. If you are visiting with us, apologies, that's a bit of an in-joke. Some sermons, when you're preparing them, you get a sense from the passage, where you're going with it. You do your research, you put in your prep time, and through the course of that process, it comes together, and you're kind of clear on what the key points are, and then you've just got to wrestle with how to articulate and communicate those kind of clearly and well. And then there are some other sermons where you put in the research, you follow the process, and yet you find that you're wrestling yourself with the text. And it doesn't all come together in a nice, clear, easy package, even for you as the preacher, perhaps especially for you as the preacher in the first instance. And in part today, I think that's because there's so much in the passage that we're going to look at this morning that is relevant to the topic and relevant to our series and its theme. And it's in part also because I'm still at a point of wrestling with this topic and this theme myself. The whole broader question of power and how we use power and how we see power used and abused, but also our own personal responses to that, experiences of it, and of course, the way in which we wield and use power ourselves. So I'm wrestling with this passage still, and it's been a wrestle to try to identify a few clear things to communicate and articulate in a helpful way. But sometimes the wrestling itself is the value of it. It's the worthwhile thing. I'm still a pilgrim on the pathway with wrestling this passage to the ground and letting it wrestle with me as well, letting God speak to me in it as well. But as we approach Easter, this year, as Matt said, just entering Holy Week today. In talking in this series about power, we're looking at how Easter flips the script on human use and abuse of power. But when I even say the word power, where does your mind go? Who or what do you first think of when you think about power? That's not a rhetorical question. Feel free to answer it if you'd like to. Nuclear power. Yes, indeed. Electricity bills. And yes, for sure. Gosh. Politicians, thank you. Authority. Performance cars. That one didn't come on my radar while I was preparing it, but yeah, that's a good one. Gandhi, okay, interesting. Well, some people may think of, thank you for those responses, but some people might think of military power, and I guess in a sense nuclear power is a form of military might. It's a threat of inflicting great disaster and harm and catastrophe. So sometimes we think about the great land armies and air forces, naval forces of the world. Power is expressed through military might often, and the US still has the largest military in the world, followed not far now by, I think, China and other emerging global powers. Some people think perhaps about economic power or the impacts of power on our economics, you might say, our finances at home. Financial power, the power of big corporations or big lobby groups on behalf of lots of big corporations, big pharma, big tobacco, big gambling, the gambling lobby, and so on. Or even the economic power that nations wield, so sort of a form of soft power, some people refer to this as in geopolitics. And we think about our own region, we think about the power of China economically, this sort of global economic, if you like, powerhouse that middle powers like Australia have to negotiate carefully between the threat of their kind of military power, but also wanting to keep open channels of trade and so on. So military power, economic power, and sometimes, of course, we think about political power and politicians. This is, of course, often where our mind goes to. Just this last week or two, President Putin was re-elected, just secured another 6 years, possibly another 12 years of power. It was a surprise outcome, wasn't it? We've got the US election coming a little bit later in this year. I think something like a third of the globe goes to the polls this year. Interestingly, we're not one of that. We're not part of that, but a lot of people are participating in voting this year. Closer to home, of course, we have Prime Minister, House of Parliament, parliamentarians. We even in Australia have a thing called the balance of power in politics. Well, this morning we're going to talk a little bit about political power. It's a dangerous place to go to, but it's also an important place to go to because we can't talk about power in this series without trying to grapple with what it is that the Bible might say to us about the political realm. It's certainly a place in which we see power sometimes used well and sometimes not used well. But interestingly, when we think of power, most of us think about other people. Who, when I said, where does your mind go when I say the word power, thought about themselves, about your power? Because most of us here probably think, oh, compared to all those things, I'm relatively powerless. But whether we recognize it or not, whether we walk the corridors of palaces or parliaments, you and I all have some kind of power. Maybe that's more obvious for some than others. If we manage or lead people, then it's sort of clearer that we have some kind of power over other people in our workplace, for example. But even if whether you do or don't manage other people, lead other people, if you work as a nurse, you have a level of power over your patients, their care, perhaps their morale, their recovery, maybe even to some extent their medication. Of course, there's lots of checks and balances in place. If you work as a school teacher or early educator, you have some level of power over the kids in your class or your care. If you pastor a church, you have a kind of power, the power perhaps of the pulpit. It might be more limited than a lot of people imagine, but a type of power all the same. But even if you're a husband or a wife or a parent or a friend, in so many domains you have power over aspects of the well-being, the emotions, the feelings, the self-confidence, even in some cases the finances and practical experiences of life for those around you. Our words have power. Proverbs 18:21 says that the tongue has the power of life and death. The tongue has the power of life and death. But as well as our words, our actions have power. And it may not feel like it's on the same scale as what we see of those in high positions. But I would argue that much of the use, misuse, and abuse of power happens not just in the staterooms, but in the staff rooms and the classrooms. Not only in the boardrooms, but in the family rooms and even in the bedrooms of ordinary people. So here's a question for you and I to wrestle with this morning. In what ways and in what areas do you have power? In what ways and what areas do you have power? Whatever your age or stage of life, vocation or occupation. But here's the real kicker. In what ways do you use it? You know, I have to say, as a leader heading up the team here at New Vine, this is something I continue to wrestle with. It's the challenge of stewarding whatever power we have so we wield it well and wield it wisely. As I said earlier, I'm a pilgrim on the path in all of this. And even trying to prepare this sermon has caused me to wrestle with it afresh. How do I use those many sort of subtle forms of power that I have? Do I use it well and wisely or otherwisely? Well, as we look at a famous passage this morning from the events leading up to the death of Jesus, the passage forces us to think about the dynamics of human use and abuse of power in the political arena. And by that I mean, for our purposes this morning, the realm of government, if you like, human government, in whatever historical form that might be, whether it's a king, an ancient empire, a president, a parliament, or so on. In our passage today from John's Gospel, we find a famous scene of political confrontation, coercion, manipulation, and capitulation, and ultimately an almost unthinkable misuse and abuse of power that sets up for us the starkest of contrasts, which we see at Easter and we'll see in the sermons to come in the next week, between the worst ways of wielding human power and the way that God wields a far, far greater and a radically better way of power. But as we look at this encounter this morning, I want to zoom out, but then zoom back in again between the political arena, which is just another place where power can be used and misused, but it's often the space that's where that is writ large for all to see, the worst and the best of human use of power. And I want to zoom back in to the personal, to think about how the passage challenges us to change how we employ power in our own spheres of influence, myself included. Well, many of our amazing young adults are away camping this weekend, but here's a Bible reading that we prepared earlier from Dan. Bill, thanks, Dan.
John 18, 28 to 40. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in an uprising.
Well, thanks very much to Dan. Well, to get a little bit of backstory, particularly if you're new to this passage and what's going on there, or you're new to church perhaps, and this is unfamiliar. The land of Israel in the first century is ruled by the Roman Empire under the oversight, at this point in time, of a Roman governor called Pontius Pilate. There are various Jewish authorities, including religious authorities, overseen by Caiaphas, the high priest, all of which existed in this kind of uneasy, if not openly hostile, relationship to Rome and their governing overlords. Well, at this point in John's telling of the Jesus story, Jesus has been arrested by those Jewish authorities who are fed up with him rocking the religious boat and for allowing his followers to proclaim him as the Jewish Messiah. And while the Romans let the Jews run their own religious affairs fairly well unhindered most of the time, thanks, Cass. Thank you. Roman law still didn't allow the Jews, at least in most cases, to execute people who violated those religious laws. The Roman Empire, however, while bound by its own laws, altogether routinely executed those who threatened its authority. Rebels, insurrectionists, traitors, deserters from the army, runaway slaves. It was a long, long list. For some, the worst form of execution was reserved, the worst of the worst. The insurgents, the insurrectionist rebels, and that was crucifixion. So as we see from the scene that Dan read to us, in the early hours of the first Easter, the Jewish authorities have sent Jesus to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, hoping to persuade him to more or less rubber stamp the death sentence that they want to impose upon Jesus for, as I say, rocking their religious boat. Now, we know about Pilate from a number of historical sources, including this one. It's the Pilate inscription, a little bit hard to read there, obviously. But this dates back to Pilate's own rule. From what we do know, scholars generally today regard Pilate in a pretty poor light as a governor. As a regional governor, he was probably hoping that a successful stint in the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire would lead onto higher office back in Rome or closer to home. Tradition holds that he was actually Scottish in origin, but we don't know that for sure. Perhaps Pilate harboured further political ambitions and aspirations like a lot in government do today. What we do know is that the empire in Rome needed a steady supply of corn from Egypt to feed Rome's citizens and armies in its eastern provinces. And much of this had to be transported through the province of Judea. But the Middle East then, in the first century, as it is today in the 21st century, was a tinderbox, and thus a career killer for many a Roman official who failed to keep a lid on things. Like various colonial governors since, Pilate seems to have sought to succeed through a mix of brutal suppression interspersed with moments of appeasement to try to keep the local religious leaders happy. By this stage in his governorship, we think, the Jewish leaders have already complained to Rome several times about Pilate's rule. Not a good look for an aspiring politician. Indeed, we know eventually that he was dismissed from office because the Judeans convinced Rome he was guilty of bullying, provocative and offensive behaviour. So that's just a little bit of the political backstory to today's story. In our passage, we see the Jewish leaders bring Jesus to Pilate, to whom he asks, to the leaders he asks, what charges are you bringing? In other words, he's kind of saying, this better be important. You better have proper grounds to be bothering me. Well, to start with, the Jewish leaders give a kind of a veiled response. They sort of sidestep the question. Or we found him guilty, or we wouldn't be bringing him to you. But Pilate, of course, refuses to play ball and says, well, if he's guilty under your laws, you deal with him. But they reply, well, we'd love to, but there's that thing where we're not allowed to execute anyone. And at this point, evidently aware of the claims about Jesus, seems like he's just playing hardball to start with, Pilate asks the accused straight out, so are you? Are you the king of the Jews? Maybe he's hoping that Jesus will deny it and he can send him on his way, or perhaps he's actually hoping that in a kind of a fit of patriotic zeal, Jesus will confess and then he'll be able to deal with it pretty quickly, if brutally as well. But either way, he seems aware not only of his responsibility to Roman law, not to find an innocent man guilty, but also the way in which the Jewish leaders are trying to manipulate him to get their way. Instead of getting either of those responses, Jesus, as he often does, exercises his own power in this moment and this setting by answering a question with a question. Is that your own belief? Will you believe that? Or is that just what you've heard from others? And after a little bit of back and forth, he offers this famous line: "My kingdom is not of, or perhaps better, from this world." The Greek can be read a couple of different ways, and I think that has led to us translating it in an ambiguous way on many occasions. A better translation is not of this world. My kingdom is not of this world. A better translation is my kingdom is not from this world. As N.T. Wright explains, the point here is that Jesus' kingdom does not originate with this world, certainly not with the way the world is now, but it is definitely and concretely for this world. In other words, Jesus' kingdom is not one to be appointed by or revoked by Caesar or any human authority. His authority is from above. It's a higher authority entirely. But Jesus isn't, and this is important to note, limiting his power here to a mere spiritual realm. He's not saying, my kingdom is just a spiritual thing that's not concerned with earthly power, only with saving souls. I'm not saying that's not part of it. I'm saying that's not the whole of it. What he is saying is that my authority is not derived from human authority, nor from the military might of my followers. If it was, he says, they'd have fought to prevent my arrest. Nor is his authority appointed from a throne in Rome or anyone else on earth, as Pilate's had been. Instead, his authority is from God's higher rule over all creation. Well, Pilate seizes on this all the same, and he says, aha, so you are a king then. And then Jesus again allows that to be Pilate's confession. It's interesting, isn't it, that John's telling, it's Pilate who confesses that Jesus is a king, albeit unwittingly. So you are a king. And then Jesus allows that to be Pilate's confession and says this instead. You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. What's he getting at there? Well, there's different ways of understanding this and wrestling with it. And I think it's multi-layered, truth being a really key theme in John's gospel and in Jesus' message overall. But on another level, this is legal language. You see, the Romans prided themselves that truth and getting to truth was at the heart of their whole legal system. Even today, we still talk about police investigations and the courts getting to the truth. So, and while there's more to it than this, Jesus may be seen here as laying down a challenge to Pilate. Is Pilate really open to the truth, to getting to the truth, to following to the truth? The truth teller has come before him. Will Pilate really seek the truth, or will he disregard it in making his judgments? Will he listen to and recognize the truth that Jesus has the higher authority, the higher form of kingship, not the truth that's decided at the point of the sword or by the power of Rome? Well, famously, Pilate dismisses the discussion of truth, but to begin with, seems like he will at least uphold justice based on the truth as best he can determine it. Jesus, he sees, is clearly no threat to Rome. The charges are kind of ridiculous, really. Whatever religious crimes Jesus may have committed was for the Jews themselves to determine and deal with, not the legal Roman legal system. But in doing so, in dismissing and wanting to dismiss the charges, he misses a moment to seek the truth that Jesus offers him, that there is a higher allegiance than Caesar in Rome, that there is a better way of power, that there is a true king of the world, and it looks radically different to his own understanding of authority and governance. And by missing that moment, Pilate soon finds himself entangled in intrigue, untruth, and finally, injustice. You see, at this point, Pilate could and should, under Roman law, not to mention just moral decency, have released Jesus and just sent him on his way. So why doesn't he? To do so would have rendered justice and fulfilled his obligation to Roman law. Why don't I release him to you as the one prisoner it's custom for me to release a Passover? Why that kind of line? Well, for all his bluster and belligerence, Pilate appears anxious of repeating any previous missteps that have stained his political ambitions and aspirations by having the Jews appeal again to Rome about yet another of his decisions, especially one so sensitive as releasing a potential insurgent. So he's looking for a way to put it back onto the Jewish leaders. It's your custom that I release someone at Passover. So let's use that custom of yours to do so. Then any blame would be back on them. But in the process, of course, he can't resist a dig at the Jewish leaders and perhaps at Jesus. He says, why don't I release this King of the Jews? Possibly because of that provocation, or more likely because they were just determined on it anyway. The Jewish leaders will have none of it. No, give us Barabbas, they famously cry. So Pilate decides to take a different tack, which brings us to our second reading from Raphael. Thank you very much.
Today we'll be reading John, chapter 19, verses 1 through 16. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no bias for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no bias for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, his face was even more afraid, and when he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus, but Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Do you not realize I have power either to free you or crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat him down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement. It was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about noon. "Here is your king," said Pilate to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified.
Thanks, Raphael. Thank you. Who's bravely hanging in there with me this morning so far? You might be wondering, why are we talking about all this politics and stuff? Why aren't we just focusing on the main message of Easter? Well, That really matters, of course. But in the context of this series, we're trying to grapple with how we live out the message of Easter and the gospel in our world today when it comes to domains of power. And how do we make sense of political power in light of the scriptures? That's why I'm kind of reading this passage in a particular way, as I've said. Now, there's lots going on, of course, in there. And we're just trying to pick up this one thread. Well, in the passage that Raphael just read to us, when the Jewish leaders rebuff Pilate's attempts to release Jesus without charge, Pilate tries this different tack, hoping to appease them by punishing Jesus pretty severely, both by mockery and humiliation, and then through a physical flogging. And by making a parody of Jesus' claims to kingship, he seems to hope to show the Jewish rulers that such claims are ludicrous. Jesus is clearly no king. He's a caricature of a king. Jesus, in Pilate's view, has been named, shamed, and badly beaten. Can't they now just let him crawl back to his Galilean bolt hole, all the while, and lick his wounds, and learn to not mess with the might of Rome in future? And all the while, Pilate will have upheld his responsibility to Rome by not letting a potential insurgent off lightly, nor have condemned an innocent man to capital punishment. But the Jewish leaders, of course, refuse to be appeased. And when Pilate insists that Jesus is not guilty under Roman law, they finally detail their charges against him. He had to die for blasphemy of claiming to be the Son of God. Again, there's heaps we could unpack there, but all of that leads to a moment when Pilate makes his power play over Jesus. The power play that human power often resorts to when backed into a corner. Don't you realize who I am? Don't you realize the power I have? Don't you realize I have the power of your life and death in my hands? Just say it straight, because I could let you go or I could crucify you. Here we have laid bare human misuse and abuse of power at its most naked. The threat of the use of violence, of life and death. But actually, Pilate has stepped off course. The power invested in him by Rome is the power to govern justly and fairly, to put down genuine threats to Roman rule, yes, but otherwise to render justice. He is not given power to unjustly execute anyone, particularly when he knows that they are guilty. Justice in this instance demanded that Jesus be freed. But Pilate, in a moment of frustration, perhaps misinterprets his power, and ultimately that leads him to misuse his power. I just want to pause there for a moment, because this is so interesting. People in all sorts of positions of authority misinterpret their power, leading them to misuse that power. Presidents who decide that because of their position, they have the power to send hundreds of thousands of their citizens to war, to harm and be harmed. Other presidents who assert that because they were once elected, they now have absolute immunity from prosecution no matter what they do, and even should have the power to dictate the outcome of future elections according, some might say, to their own egos. In other spheres, though, movie moguls or middle managers decide that because they fund a movie or give an employee an opportunity, that gives them the power over their young stars or young employees who must comply with their sexual advances. Or closer to home, husbands or boyfriends or partners who misinterpret their position as allowing them to wield coercive control over their partners, where they get to go, when, with whom, and how they get to spend their time or money. even parents who misinterpret their responsibilities as giving them the right to control their kids for the parents' own convenience. The misuse and abuse of power sometimes starts with subtle misinterpretations of our authority and our responsibility. But back to the story. Because we come now to the famous line where Jesus says to Pilate, "You would have no power over me if it wasn't given to you from above." Now, Pilate, of course, likely thinks of Caesar here sitting in Rome. That's where his power comes from. But Jesus, of course, we know, is referring to a higher power, the greater ruler over all things, over all time, over all creation, over all the heavens and the earth. Well, Pilate tries once or twice more, but the Jewish leaders level up their threats, basically threatening to accuse Pilate of treason if he won't execute Jesus. Pilate, now realizing that this is not going to end well for someone, and especially if that someone isn't him, capitulates to their threats. Okay, so in summary, what can we highlight from all of this for the purpose of our series on power and to help us make biblical sense of political power? Well, from this encounter and from the wider biblical teaching on creation, on judgment and new creation, we can say, I think, a few things. Firstly, and it'd be great to have time to unpack this. It's probably a whole series in itself. In fact, maybe we'll do a series on this sometime. But firstly, that actually government is God's idea. In the creation account, we see God bringing order from chaos and then inviting human beings, his image bearers, to take up the task of being stewards of that creation. And that includes, we might reasonably conclude, includes governing, ordering, and organizing human society. We see this not only in the creation account, but again in this encounter between Christ and Pilate and elsewhere in the New Testament. The scholar Tom Wright, again, is helpful here. He says, the God we see in Jesus Christ intends that there should be structures of human authority and the ordering of community life. Christians are not called to be anarchists, to throw off all forms of government, because the God we believe in is the creator, the God who brings order out of chaos. The New Testament, he says, is quite clear. God intends that there should be human power structures within the world. Secondly, we might say that government and human use of power is intended, however, for good. Human government has a God-given function to perform in the world. The exercise of power is intended for things like protecting life, preserving freedoms, and promoting human well-being and the flourishing of our world. Thirdly, we might say that all human authority, including that of Pilate's, as we see from the text, is thus derived from God, even where it is not being employed for good. God establishes human authority because he intends that the world be structured and ordered and well governed. But of course, in a now fallen world, all human government is inevitably tainted to a greater or lesser degree by sin and self-interest, by political ambition, by human anxiety or aspirations. And so the good use of power is all too often perverted for personal benefit. Nevertheless, it would seem that some government is better than no government. Perhaps even that tyranny is better than anarchy, if only just. Although, of course, there are many far better options in between. Now, let me be clear. The fact that human authority is derived from God doesn't mean, in my reading of Scripture, that God endorses all particular specific governments or rulers over others. Or to put it differently, it doesn't mean that just because people like Pilate find themselves in places of power, they therefore must have God's tick of approval for their policies or actions or ways of wielding power. Because while recognizing that human authority is ultimately derived from God, human authority and use of power all too often departs from God's good purposes for it. So we need to recognize both that it often departs from God's good purposes for it, and also that God himself seems to allow a lot of human say in the rise and fall of who governs and how governing powers come to be. The history of human rule suggests rulers come to power through all sorts of intrigue and evil means, and sometimes through more transparent and better means. And often governments swing back and forth between two very different parties or two very different people. It's dangerous, therefore, to hold really tightly to the idea that God is on this side or that side, that he proves or appoints this tyrant or autocrat, or is directly behind the election of this Republican or Democrat, or the Greens or the Libs or the Nats or Labor, behind the election of this leader or that leader, the rise of this king or that one. In fact, God may be far more interested in what they do once they are in power than how they got there. Because I think we also see from the Gospels and the New Testament that Jesus redefines human power and sets a new way of ruling. We saw this in Zach's sermon a couple of weeks ago when the two brothers, James and John, are positioning themselves for power, thinking in human power structure terms. Hey, Jesus, let us be the ones who sit in the high seats of power when you come into your kingdom. Jesus replies, that's not how it works in my kingdom. The rulers of the nations lord it over others, but among you, it's going to be different. Anyone who wants to be great must be a servant, and whoever wants to be at the top must be the slave of all. Here, in this encounter that we've been looking at, Jesus is not going to overthrow Pilate's government, rise up and win a great victory over Rome. He's going to overthrow death and darkness itself. He's going to rise up from the worst that the world can do with power to win a great victory over evil and all misuse and abuse of power. We will see in the sermons and Easter services to come more precisely how it is that Jesus redefines power. So join us on Friday and Sunday if you can. But God, we might say, has also appointed Jesus as the greater king over all nations. For now, as he didn't with Pilate, God doesn't always overthrow human power systems that have lost their way. But one day, he will bring them under his ultimate rule. That means not that he will rule over them in the way they've ruled. It means that they will come to rule in the way that he has redefined power. That one day all human government will govern on the basis of love, mercy, compassion, goodness, to protect, preserve, and promote human and cosmic well-being. And finally, we can say human authorities will ultimately be held accountable for how they have wielded power. Tom Wright says it this way: the fact that God remains sovereign over all human powers and authorities means human authorities are not divine, and they are called to account ultimately by God himself. Jesus Christ will one day call the whole world to account and put the whole world to rights, flooding the entire creation with justice, his peace, and his glory. And the authorities that are charged in the present time, not only with implementing God's order in creation, but also anticipating God's final order, the bringing of justice, healing, peace, and glory to God's world. Well, let me just skip over a bit and wrap it up. If the music team want to come up on stage now. What failed in the moment that Jesus stood before Pilate wasn't actually the laws of the day. The laws of the day provided a framework for fairness. What failed was one person's application of that law and failure to uphold justice in that moment. It was one person's human decision-making in that moment that led to this great injustice that we commemorate on Good Friday, on the cross. One which God himself nevertheless uses to redeem the world. To redeem those of us who will bow our knee to Jesus as Lord. But also to redeem all of the broken systems and structures in our world that cause some good and so much harm to so many, even today. That's a vision, a political vision of God's redemptive work on the cross and through the empty grave. He invites us all as individuals to come under his reign in the world today. But he also holds out the hope that every injustice, every broken system that perpetuates injustice, every personal decision by people in high places that brings about injustice or suffering on others will come to an end. And that those ways of ruling and reigning will finish. And in a new creation, a properly governed creation, a rightly and justly governed creation, all of that will be history. That's a pretty wonderful vision in my view. I might have got some of the details wrong. As I say, I'm still wrestling with a lot of this myself. But if even some of that is true, what a wonderful thing that God is doing, has done, and will do in our world. And he invites us to be part of it now. For the church to be an advance party of what the new creation will look like. And that leads me just to zoom in as I close again. You may never walk the corridors of power in palaces or parliaments, but you have a role in governing God's world. In your big, small, tiny spheres of influence. You have a way of pointing the world to a glorious future that awaits when God finally intervenes and says, enough. Now it's my way. So if not on the political level, then on the personal level, when you make choices and decisions that affect others, where you do exercise some level of even subtle control or influence over others, in what ways and in what areas do you have power? And how will you use it? In the way of Pilate or the way of Jesus? The way of the world or the way of the coming King?